Joining me today, Labour MP Peter Kyle, Conservative MP Faye Jones, The Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Soda and the editor of City AM, Andy Sylvester. Today, should all NHS workers be double vaxxed?
We've yet to make the final decision, but if you're asking me, is that something that I'm minded to do? Yes, I am.
I wouldn't make it mandatory. I think that risks lots of people losing their job.
The Chancellor prepares to deliver a budget and spending review.
I want people to be able to keep more of their money. I want to reward people for working.
So why is the tax burden the highest in decades? The Mayor of London wants your money too.
Doing nothing is not an option, and you know what, for me this is an issue of social justice. Who do we think suffers the worst consequences of toxic air? It's the poorest Londoners.
That smell, you don't even have to see it to know what it is because it just hits the back of the nasal cavity.
Should MPs vote to stop water companies dumping sewage in the sea and our rivers? Let's start with the story you heard there in the headlines about whether it should be compulsory for NHS staff and healthcare workers to receive double vaccinations. Faye, should it be?
Well, the government is looking closely at this issue, and I think it's really important that we do look at the science. The Health Secretary has made it clear that he is actively considering it. So we will wait to see what comes forward over the next couple of days. But I think that what's really important to remember is the paramount concern here is keeping people safe. And I will wait and see what happens and what data the government brings forward. But anything that keeps NHS workers safer is a very good thing in my book.
Right, well, we've just heard Sajid Javid saying he is minded to do it. So what do you think?
Well, I want to wait for the Health Secretary to come forward with a firm decision. I'm sure he will come to Parliament and explain his reasoning, and we'll look at the data and then make a decision. But I would say it's really important that NHS workers are protected. I think so far 95% of NHS workers have had both their vaccines since the vaccine rollout programme started. So keeping them safe is absolutely paramount.
Peter, if Labour want all NHS staff to be double vaccinated, how do you propose to increase vaccination rates amongst NHS staff, if not by mandating it?
Well, we've decided that actually we need to follow the policy that works. And when you look at what's happening in Wales, for example, where they're working very closely with staff in actually quite a sensitive way, it is having a much better impact than it is in England, where actually if you look at care homes, they're just mandating from the top down, and what that's doing is driving people away from this. Well,
except Sajid Javid said it has actually led to a surge in care home staff being vaccinated.
No, but we haven't. It hasn't been as effective as it has in Wales. Wales actually has a better rate, but also actually Wales is doing better with vaccinations all through the cohorts. So what Faye just said was follow the science. The science doesn't tell us how to achieve a policy. We do need to make sure that everybody who is eligible is vaccinated. We want to follow the best way of doing that. And so far, it means following the relationships, building relationships. And the relationships people have in the workplace are really important. If government are mandating, it breaks the relationship and actually it doesn't get you to where you need to be.
Where are you on this, Andy? Because actually the figures show that in England there are now 106,000 unvaccinated staff, of which 32,000 are in London. In some NHS trusts, as many as 1 in 6 workers have not been fully vaccinated.
Well, you need a plan to replace those people, because I think the vast majority of people right across the United Kingdom would think it's slightly barking that you could work in a health or social care environment.
So you think it should be mandated?
Absolutely, I think it should, and I think most people would agree. I think in the same way that people taking a driving test in order to drive a lorry for HGV, people think this is part of the role, and within the NHS and social care, you are fundamentally responsible for the people you care about. The science that we're talking about, and Peter talked about following the science, and Faye talked about following the science says that the vaccine is safe, and it's the most effective way for us to move on from COVID-19, and the most effective way to ensure people don't get seriously ill. So to me, it's a complete no-brainer.
Sonia, where are you?
I don't have any moral objection at all at making vaccination compulsory. I think there's a precedent for it. Surgeons have to be vaccinated against certain diseases in order to be able to operate on patients. My only slight concern would be on a practical level. So the NHS is facing a massive staffing crisis. We've got so many staff working in teams that are incomplete, having to cover for colleagues. So I think practically we just need to make sure that it doesn't result in people leaving roles rather than taking up vaccination. But I have have no moral objection.
Joe, if I might here, there's a difference between actually people accepting a job where they know they have to have the vaccination to get the job, than forcing people who are already in the job and changing their contractual relationship and saying that it has to be forced even though it's not in their contract to start with. That's the difference here. You don't get a job as a driver knowing that you're going to have to take the driving test halfway through doing the job.
It's a bad example, but there are lots of examples already in the private sector at the moment in the city of companies saying, brilliant, you can work from home if you'd like, but you're going to have a jab if you want to come into the office, and if you're not in this meeting in the office, then that's going to have some influence.
I just want to do what works, and what works so far is using that relationship to guide people towards it who are vaccine hesitant.
Right, but the figures are also, Faye, that 40,000 care workers have refused so far to have the vaccine and will refuse to take the vaccine. That means they'll no longer be able to work in a care home from the 11th of November, which is the government's deadline for care home staff. What will happen to those care homes?
Well, the government is taking active steps to look at recruitment. Last week, the government
by the 11th of November?
Well, as I say, last week the government announced a £162 million package specifically for the social care sector to increase workforce recruitment and retention. So it is not just a one-track approach. We are looking at this in the round and making sure that we can continue the high level of care that there is in the social care sector.
Right. Do you think that they'll actually carry out his threat? That deadline will be a hard deadline of the 11th of November. If you haven't been vaccinated, you will not be able to work in a care home.
I think what's really important is driving up vaccination as much as possible. So I do welcome the Health Secretary's tough stance on this. I think it's absolutely clear that the vaccination does really weaken the link that the disease is having. So I think it's really important that we do take a tough line, that we encourage everybody to get a vaccine. And we have been doing really, really well. I think something like 85% of all of those eligible have had at least one dose of the vaccine. So we know, and I can speak from personal experience, that the vaccine does reduce the impacts that COVID has on you. So I think it's absolutely important to be tough on this.
And that hard deadline will have to happen, though, won't it? Because otherwise people won't believe it in the NHS more broadly.
The big challenge we have with vaccinations is children, aged 12 plus, 12 to 18. Only 13% of children have actually had the vaccine. You know, I said to Nadine Zahawi, when he was vaccines minister back in July, that this needs to be tackled. He said to me, we didn't need to worry about it because there will be a wall of vaccinated adults that will protect them. You know, government has had the wrong attitude to this all the way through. We need to stop focusing on where those small numbers of people actually are who are unvaccinated and get to the actual bulk of people, because it should have been done over the summer so that children were vaccinated before they went back to school, not doing it now where there's actually anti-vax protesters outside school gates disrupting schools, just trying to go about their business.
Faye?
Well, I was just going to come back on Peter's point there. 90% of the population is showing antibodies, and I think that's really evidence that our vaccination programme is working extremely well. 86% of all of those over 12 have had at least one dose. I think that is a fantastic record so far. And we're going further, not just having vaccinations in schools. Parents and guardians are now able to book jabs for their children in walk-up centres. So we are rolling this out as fast as we can.
215,000 students are off school right now. And then we look at all of the adults who are self-isolating at the moment. Unfortunately, the government just has this sort of attention deficit syndrome when it comes to finishing projects. It throws all of its energy into starting things off. It is a terrible finisher of projects. It has taken its eye off the ball when it comes to vaccinations, particularly when it comes to young people. America had finished the programme by July, finished 9 million children aged 12 to 19. We haven't even started.
Faye, do you want to respond before we move on?
Well, I mean, Peter is obviously never going to credit the government for this fantastic rollout of the vaccine that has been going on over the last year.
Well, he's talking about boosters and also 12 to 15-year-olds.
But I think the evidence speaks for itself. 86% of the country, people over 12 who are eligible for the vaccination, have had at least one dose. But the imperative thing now is getting more vaccines, that third booster rolled out. So I think the evidence does actually speak for itself.
All right, we're going to move on because there's been an awful lot of pre-announcements ahead of the budget, rather unusually, actually, before Wednesday and before Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, stands up in the House of Commons. We've just had another important announcement. It's understood the national living wage is set to rise to £9.50 an hour. The Chancellor will confirm that rise. We're expecting that on Wednesday. It'll apply to all of those over 23 years old. The current rate is £8.91. Peter, you must welcome that.
Any raise in the minimum wage we would welcome. I don't know why it didn't go to the £10 that actually is being called for, because that would put money straight into the pockets of where it's needed, because most people who are poor in this country are in work poor, so we need to make sure that we get we cancel out some of the challenges that actually the real hardships are going to be caused by the cost of living crisis, coupled with the cut to universal credit, which has come in £20 a week. That's where the real pinch is. We need to make sure that we are taxing fairly and spending wisely, which is what Rachel Reeves has called for, and set out a reconfiguration of where we tax, where we spend, and how we support people who are in low incomes in work.
Faye, could he have gone further?
Well, that is news to me, and I'm afraid you are much more clued in on what's happened on the budget. I hadn't heard that announcement had been made.
We've only just heard it ourselves. That's why we're breaking that news. And we understand that is what he's going to announce, just to caveat that.
Right. Well, of course, we'll all find out on Wednesday, and I know the papers over the last few days have been full of speculation. But I think what's clear, if we can read the tea leaves, what's clear is that this is going to be a budget which sets us on the road to recovery. And I think that's absolutely crucial. We're looking, hopefully, at strong investment in our public services and delivering that high-wage economy that we all need to see.
Well, we'll talk about that in just a minute. But just getting your reaction, Andy.
I mean, it's not wildly surprising. The government has talked about this. I believe the Low Pay Commission has recommended something in this region. It's certainly not 15 quid now, which of course one of Peter's frontbench colleagues resigned over at Labour conference. But more to the point, if you hike the national living wage, that obviously is going to increase costs on business, and we can argue until the cows come home as to whether that's a good thing or not. But it isn't like businesses aren't facing other costs going up at the moment, be it in the supply chain or indeed in taxes. And it'd be interesting to see how many of those people in seeing their wages increased by the living wage have to hand some of it back in the increase in national insurance. And that's the issue that we've got here, is the government is seemingly obsessed with sort of headline announcements like this, which is great, and we can move on again, argue till the cows come home about whether or not a national living wage is a good idea. It used to be called a minimum wage. But we have to put it in the wider context, which is that it's another cost on business.
Sonia?
So I think any increase in the national minimum wage is a good thing. I think it's quite shocking, actually, in this country that if you're paid at the minimum wage and you've got kids, you basically just don't earn enough without support from the state to sort of be able to kind of keep your kids out of poverty, as it were. That's why we've got so many families in work poverty. But the one thing I will say is that increases in the national minimum wage will never, ever make up for the huge cuts to tax credits we've seen to low-income families with children over the last decade. Low-paid parents, some of them have lost thousands of pounds a year since 2010, the equivalent of that in tax credits. And George Osborne and Philip Hammond always said, you know, we're cutting tax credits, but look, we are increasing the national minimum wage. But those increases in the national minimum wage never, ever compensated for the huge losses. So I think this is a chancellor giving a bit with one hand to low-paid parents, but taking away so much more with another.
Right. Faye, what do you say to that?
Well, I think it's really important to wait and see. I'm afraid I haven't been cited on that announcement, but I think it is a good thing, and that's what we're expecting the Chancellor to announce. But I do want to just come back on the universal tax credit. We need to stop calling it a cut. It isn't a cut. We made it very clear that it was a response to the pandemic, and rightly so, but it was a temporary uplift. We said that all the way along. And, you know, I fully understand what Peter is trying to say about universal credit, and I would love to see the £20 go back into it. But where do we get the £6 billion?
Well, you could have voted for it, but you chose not to.
Well, where do we get the £6 billion to pay for it? We can't keep on spending forever. And we made it really, really clear that it was a temporary uplift. It's not a cut.
Well, the last budget, Rishi Sunak found £24 billion in a one-line giveaway with the super deductor, which went to the top 1% of businesses. If you can find that for the top 1% of businesses, he says yesterday that he's maxed out on spending on schools, even though he's only giving 10% of what's asked by his own schools catch-up commissioner. I just think he's got his priorities wrong. In going into this budget, we've got to think that we have a 20th century tax and spend policy, which in a 21st century economy, it is not reflecting where wages come from. It is not reflecting where business actually, if you want to put money back into businesses, let's start equalising the balance between online retailers and physical retailers, which is really clobbering businesses in the Midlands, in high streets in the Midlands and in the north and in coastal communities, non-metropolitan communities right around the southeast of England. Let's make sure we reform the business tax in the way that Rachel Reeves has set out, that Rishi Sunak has promised but never actually delivered.
Faye?
Well, you're asking me to speculate on, you know, ideas
Have an
that
opinion.
are... Well, if I can just finish, you're asking me to speculate on ideas. We don't know what's in the budget on Wednesday. You know, Peter can sit there with, you know, all of his,
we've got quite a good idea.
All of his plans and ideas about what he would do. But I'd like to see exactly what's going to happen in the budget on Wednesday.
Well, you and me and everybody else, and we will find out, of course, on Wednesday with our extended programme here on BBC Two. One thing we do know, which has been announced and confirmed, this is in the Times, billions more for NHS in bid to tackle backlog. Rishi Sunak's budget cash boost will speed up diagnosis and cut waits for surgery. It's nearly £6 billion for the NHS. It's capital spending. It will go on physical infrastructure and equipment rather than day-to-day spending. Faye, it is a lot of money, nearly £6 billion, and it may go towards cutting the backlog. But how do you do it if you don't recruit more staff?
But we're doing both. As I explained earlier on, we are already looking at recruitment and retention in social care. But I think actually the £5.9 billion is not to be sniffed at. I have constituents who are waiting a really long time for tests before they can even begin treatment. We all know that we are facing a huge backlog within the NHS, and this is not just money thrown into the black hole. This is money for equipment, for new community diagnostic hubs, for new surgical hubs. And I think this is really important, that this isn't actually just writing a cheque. This is for the kit and equipment that will make the difference.
Right, Andy, it's not money going into a black hole.
I think we've heard that before, unfortunately, and oftentimes it has fallen into the black hole of NHS spending. When you look at new OECD figures out today, the UK is now spending more, only second in the world, as a percentage of its GDP on healthcare, only behind the United States, and none of us want to go there, but significantly more than a vast number of European systems, which are, frankly, delivering better outcomes. We've got this problem in this country where nothing is ever enough for the NHS. It's £6 billion today. It will probably be £8 billion next year because we'll have a backlog again. Winter seems to come around every year, and yet neither party at the moment, major party, seems willing to take on, you know, reform of the NHS, thinking about different ways of doing things. Because if costs keep going up at the state they are, then there isn't going to be enough money for anything else.
I disagree with the premise here, because don't forget, going into this pandemic, there was a 10% vacancy rate in the NHS. My local hospital had a 15% vacancy rate. So this isn't something that's just emerged through COVID. This is a problem that's long-standing. So when I hear the government is now going to have a quick fix for the vacancy problem, they didn't do it in the 10 years leading up to COVID. I can't see how they're going to do it in the 10 weeks after COVID, or certainly in the next phase of COVID. When you say that the money is never enough, actually under Labour we got 18-month waiting lists down from 18 months where nobody had to wait longer. We did that within 6 years. We actually eradicated the waiting lists in the NHS. We had the highest percentage of people in the country believed in the NHS and believed in collective health by the end than they did in 1945 when we created the health service. Actually, there is enough money. There are limits to what we think we should put in order to achieve. But actually, the right type of reform. We spent £6 billion reforming the NHS. We're about to spend another £4 billion reforming to fix the mistakes of the last set of reforms. That's where the mistakes are going.
But we are looking at an ageing population. Labour in power 11 years ago, the population has aged. It's going to continue to age, and the costs are going to continue to go up if we have the current system that we have. And yet neither party, either Faye or yourself, seem willing to acknowledge the fact that actually this might be time for a root and branch reform. And if you're not going to do it now, after, you know, such a horrendous fracture in our national life, after such a crisis, when is any party going to say, actually, it's time?
We went into the 2010 election with a cross-party agreement on it, which Gordon Brown led from Downing Street. And it was George Osborne and David Cameron that pulled it apart in order to have a political to and fro during the 2010 election. So it's not fair to say that no party has had a plan. Whether that plan would have been fit for purpose 15 years later is worth debating. But actually, we did have a plan. It's not fair to say that parties haven't taken this seriously in the past.
And what do you mean by reform?
I think you have to look at hybrid models where you introduce some level, and I know I'm going to get killed on Twitter for this, but some level of private provision. You look at Australia, a place which spends less on healthcare as a proportion of GDP and delivers better outcomes. Look at Switzerland, Netherlands. All these places have different models that have embraced the world of private provision, not in a way that affects the ability to get healthcare free at the point of use, and neither does it turn us into the United States, where you have, you know, viral Twitter accounts costing you 110 grand if you have your toe run over by a bus. You know, there is a world beyond the US, and I just wish that Labour, and I'm sort of having a go at you because you're in the studio, I should be looking at Faye on the camera as well, and say that, you know, both parties need to accept that there is something fundamentally in need of change, in need of thought.
Is it time, Sonia, for that sort of change?
I think a lot of this rests on the false premise that the NHS is incredibly inefficient. Actually, if you look at international league tables, the NHS scores really well on efficiency. We do poorly on some outcomes, Andy's right, so for example, some cancer outcomes, but when it comes to efficiency, actually the NHS is really effective. If you look at the last decade, I agree with Peter. The King's Fund, the independent health think tank, said that the NHS's funding settlement over the last decade was the tightest funding settlement it's ever received. We do get what we pay for as a country, and the reality is that with an ageing population, as medical treatments and medical technologies get better and better, we should be expecting to spend more as a proportion of GDP on healthcare. That's what rich countries do over time. The alternative is a country actually where you get old and you can't get the healthcare you need, and I don't think that anybody wants to live in a country like that.
Faye, do you agree with Sonia that we should be spending more as a country, a bigger proportion of our GDP on health? It's around 8%. What should it go up to?
Well, again, I'm sorry, I don't have a percentage to give you, and I know I'm.
Well, should it
annoying,
go up, or
should
it stay the same, or should it go down?
Well, I mean, I would look to, we're 2 days out from the budget. I'm really sorry to be irritating and say wait for the budget, but I'm afraid we do have to wait and see and consider everything in the balance. But I would just challenge Andy's point, if I may briefly. I think we are taking reform seriously, and I'm afraid I can't remember the name of the former Marine General who is now coming on board to look at NHS reform. But I think we do need to have an honest and open conversation about reform. We shouldn't be frightened of people on Twitter. We love our NHS. We all agree on that, certainly. And so I think reform and having that honest conversation is a very good thing to do. Right. Does that sound, Andy, like Faye and the government are going to take on some of your suggestions?
I don't think it does, to be honest. I think there will continue to be NHS pin badges. And look, nobody's trying to disrespect the people that work within the NHS, but just as a political class, we have got to a point now where it is always about more money going in, more investment going in, and it's very rarely a discussion about is it delivering. The discussion the piece that Sonia referenced about the outcomes, the OECD puts us at 10th out of 11th amongst major economies when it comes to healthcare outcomes.
But Liz Kendall on our side,
if the NHS isn't there,
has set out a comprehensive vision.
One at a time. I'll just get Sonia and then I'll come back to you, Peter. Sonia?
I just think it's not true. The idea that, people haven't looked at the NHS and thought about root and branch reform. Actually, the issue is that we've had too much structural reform in the NHS. We had a reform done by this Conservative government that cost billions of pounds, that achieved absolutely nothing, actually distracted NHS staff from delivery. So this idea that there's some magic root and branch solution that you just get and everything will become better isn't true. We need to focus on the fundamentals of the NHS, which is, are we treating conditions early enough, or are we leaving it until things are too late, which it is what we do in this country, because a facet of underfunding is that people actually don't get the healthcare they need until their conditions have become a lot more serious, and it can end up costing the NHS a lot more in the long run. That is not stuff that is solved by structural solutions. That is stuff that is actually solved by looking at what hospitals are doing on the ground and funding early intervention treatments properly.
Right, Peter, you cited Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and the extra spending that went into the NHS during those years, but even in the recent documentary, Tony Blair wishes he'd reformed more at the time when it came to NHS and health.
And that's the lesson. So we've set out quite a clear plan of reform. I mean, Liz Kendall has set out, she's done a speech, she's done a paper, she's set out a vision for health and social care, which is using the best of both worlds. This idea that actually you have separate doctors, separate staff working in social care, when actually, when older people need care and attention, they should have one group of people working for them and around them, which actually uses the best of both systems. We're starting to map out what that will look like in practice. Compare that to the government, who's been in power for 11 years, that has a tax rise, but no plan whatsoever that has been sketched out at all. At least our side has started to sketch out what health and social care will look like going forward, and how we can actually use the best of both worlds to create a system that actually embraces older living.
Right, are you comfortable with that tax rise that we do know about, of course, the national insurance tax rise to raise that £12 and a bit billion for the post-pandemic recovery, Faye?
Well, look, no Conservative is comfortable with tax rises, and I think everyone would agree that we have been through a catastrophic shock to not just our economy but our NHS, and we need to make some very difficult decisions. So, you know, we'll see over the next couple of years whether we are able to bring some of that tax burden down. But I think everyone has agreed that we actually do need to take action here. Ideology is not going to solve the backlog within the NHS, and that's why the national insurance contributions increase is extremely important, as is the £5.9 billion that we've just announced. And I don't think that is pouring money into the black hole when we have made it clear that this is not for day-to-day spending. This is for the kit and equipment that will get people their diagnostic treatment and will be able to start their treatment.
Well, let me put this to you just before we move on. In the Mail on Sunday, high-taxing Chancellor Rishi Sunak will send UK economy crashing onto the rocks, writes former Brexit Secretary David Davis. Do you agree with him?
Well, I haven't read his article, so I don't know.
Well,
but as I would say,
it's what it says on the tin.
Based on the headline, I don't think that we can, you know, be completely wedded to ideological principles in the face of a pandemic which has caused the biggest economic shock in 300 years. Of course, we want to return to being a low-tax government, and I'm absolutely confident that we will. But we have to be prepared to make difficult decisions because certainly previous governments haven't been prepared to deal with it.
OK, let's look at this in the Evening Standard. ULEZ, the ultra-low extension zone expansion, London's pollution charge zone becomes 18 times larger, and that is happening from today, the ultra-low emission zone. Motorists who drive inside the area in non-compliant cars will face a £12.50 daily fee, while drivers of lorries and buses which are liable will have to pay £100. Let's hear from one business person, London Scaffolding Company, saying they expected the change to cost them £2,500 a week.
On top of that, we're committed to £350,000 worth of expenditure on new vehicles and loss of value on existing vehicles that we're having to dispose of. It always gets passed on to the customer somehow.
Now, we heard Khan, the Labour mayor, in the headlines. Is it justified?
I think it is. If you look at 87% of vehicles within the area are already compliant. Sadiq has launched a scheme whereby those who aren't can apply for funding in order to scrap and to repurchase. But you have to look at the bigger picture here. You know, London has a big problem with air pollution. This will save 1 million hospitalisations by 2040.
Where are you getting those figures from?
From figures that were published by the City of London, by the corporation in the run-up to this. This will save an enormous amount of hospitalisation and could save billions in pounds in healthcare by 2050. So this is an important thing for our country to do. At the moment, our city does need to move forward, simply for climate change commitments we're about to make, for air quality, for the impact that it has on young people in particular, who are paying the biggest price for air pollution. But for those people who are negatively affected by it, that 13% of people who don't have the vehicles that they need, then my advice is clear. Ask for help, because the help will be there for you.
Justified.
I mean, on public health grounds, it's difficult to say that having, you know, high-polluting cars driving around a city is a good thing. So in that sense, it is justified. But again, don't get our chap on the video is right. These costs are going to get passed on to businesses, and they get passed on to consumers.
Not all businesses.
Pardon, sorry?
Not all businesses.
Well, all businesses,
so
because
those 13% who are not using it. So not all businesses.
No, but some of those businesses will be supplying shops whose prices will go up because those providers will put their prices up. Those places will be supplying pubs who will have to put the price of a pint up. You know, these things do pass on. You can't just leather a tax onto one part of the economy and say it will be completely isolated.
And those businesses who
all
have
of these
staff
things
absences because they're in hospital, because they have lung conditions.
We can argue until the cows come home about whether or not it's justified public health ground. All I'm pointing out is there is a trade-off. Costs go up. This is a tax. It will.
This map, road charging proposed or implemented right across the UK. In terms of businesses coming out of the pandemic, Peter, again, I ask you, is it fair?
Yeah, it is fair. As I say, this has been coming for a long time. The City of London has been preparing communities for this, and there is help on hand. You know, we've got to 87% of vehicles existing or already on the road are going to be compliant already, so they won't be affected at all by this. So I think actually getting to that level of compliance before you actually start introducing charges actually shows that there is far more support than there is negative or any measures which are going to negatively impact people. I think getting down to 13% of people negatively impacted is a pretty good ratio when it comes to actually implementing a policy like this.
But it will also add to higher costs for the consumer, for motorists, Sonia. We're showing also this graph here, UK fuel prices, diesel and petrol at the pump, pence per litre. I mean, these are at extraordinarily high levels in recent times. Again, is that a charge that consumers should have to pay?
Well, Andy's right. I mean, these things carry costs, but regulation always carries costs. You know, the Clean Air Act of the last century carried costs. And we have to make a decision as a society. Our air pollution rates in London and other big cities are out of control. Has been taken to court about breaching legal limits on air pollution, and campaigners have won. We know that the levels of air pollution that we see in London, they're associated with asthma problems for children, they're associated with a higher risk of dementia. That all feeds into those hospitalisations that Peter was talking about. So we can't deny that this bears costs, but sometimes we just have to say as a society, these costs are worth paying. We have to make sure that they fall as equitably as possible. But I don't want to live in a city where, you know, children are at risk of having much worsening asthma because of air quality levels. That's just not acceptable in the 21st century.
Right. And is there, though, the issue of actually raising revenue rather than dealing with levels of pollution, Faye? Because the Treasury released documents last week that said the largest impacts of the transition away from fossil fuels will be the loss of tax revenues from, for example, fuel duties. This will make up for it, won't it?
Well, we are going to have to be innovative in how we make up that shortfall, because obviously the government does have a target of reducing fossil fuel powered cars by the end of the decade, and we do need to be ambitious. And you know, there isn't much that I would disagree with Peter about. One thing I would add is that I do think the government is taking quite robust action in the Environment Bill. For the first time, we have a legally defined target to reduce particulate matter, and we all need to work together on this. And so, but Andy's not wrong to say that this is going to be borne by someone, and this is yet another tax which is going to be borne by businesses. And I live in Mid Wales, where we are very, very lucky and we have beautifully clean air. So I'm not trying to be ignorant of the problems that London has, but I don't see that the congestion charge and the ULEZ in its previous form has reduced either congestion or emissions so far.
Right. The amount of vehicles which qualify already for this have doubled since Sadiq Khan became mayor. So we've done a lot of progress on this before actually introducing any punitive measures at all. And most of the arguments you hear against this are the same arguments that were made about tobacco smoking. And saying actually you don't want to lose the tax revenue from it, even though actually it costs the NHS far more than the country in public health measures and consequences than actually we were generating in tax in the first place.
Andy?
It's the timing, though, isn't it? I mean, we're just sort of planning around it. We are now at basically the fuel prices graph is a very good example. The national insurance is going up. That scaffolding company is being hit by increasing costs in the supply chain. We can.
Andy, don't kid me that there is a time where you would come here because the costs are low on fuel and you'd actually support it.
A world in which you've got kids coming out of school coughing away.
That's now.
All I'm saying is,
it's now. There
is a trade-off here, and at the moment, business costs are going through the roof all over the place. It will be passed on. I'm saying the same point over and over again because it's worth remarking and worth remaking.
Right, but on the revenue-raising point, Peter, low-polluting cars are exempt at the moment, aren't they, from the ultra-low emission zone charge. Do you think over time, when more people are driving electric cars, that in order to make up that shortfall, they'll be charged anyway?
Actually, we've acknowledged this for quite a long time because I was on the inquiry into electrification of our transport system when the Bayes Select Committee did it, when Rachel Reeves was chair. And we asked the government this 4 years ago about what are the preparations for understanding the change in taxation when it comes down the line. So, yes, we are going to have to adjust to it. Of course we are. But the key challenge we have now is actually getting conversion fast enough and the infrastructure built quickly enough so that actually we can convert fast enough to make it worthwhile, because we can't have this halfway house for too long.
Yeah, that I would completely agree on. The electric vehicle infrastructure in the United Kingdom is not fit for the government's ambition currently to have us all driving green cars.
And consumer demand is overtaking the ambition of government itself. And we've known this for a number of years now. So government bringing forward the target was too little, too late, when the rest of the country, the rest of the world was overtaking us, including China.
Of course, one thing I would say, sorry to jump in, is if we do lose this revenue from fuel duty because of green vehicles, then it would be nice to hear one political party say potentially that could just be a tax cut for Brits rather than working out a different way to raise it.
Right, who was coming in there, Faye or Sonia? I couldn't hear.
I was just going to add that I can't let Peter off the hook here. The Welsh Labour government has a big responsibility. We talk about not having the infrastructure for electric vehicles. Come to Mid Wales and you'll see our mountains, and you'll see that there is absolutely no ambition from the Welsh Labour government to do anything on putting in electric vehicle infrastructure. But also, electric vehicles are not the silver bullet. I am really proud of the company in my constituency that produces a hydrogen fuel cell car, and I really want the government to be ambitious in looking at the range of solutions, because it's not just one thing that is going to solve the air quality issue.
All right, Peter, we're going to leave it there because we're going to talk about sewage. Faye, I think you mentioned it earlier, or you mentioned the Environment Bill. Let's put it that way. Conservative MPs have faced something of a backlash on social media after most of them voted against a Lord's amendment to the Environment Bill last week. It was trying to make water companies reduce discharges of sewage into rivers. This was how the story was covered by the website Evolve Politics. Here's a list of every MP who just voted to allow water companies to continue dumping raw sewage into our rivers. Faye, you tweeted in response to that story saying, deeply misleading. It ignores the massive flaw in the amendment, i.e. forcing taxpayers to pay up to £600 billion to dig up Victorian sewerage system, and the work the government is already doing to reduce discharge from storm overflows. Why was the amendment so deeply flawed?
Look, I'm really glad that we are at last talking about this, because for